I'll teach you to ride, and you'll teach me to love," the cowboy said while she tried to leave town. Dust lifted from the main street of Rattlespur like breath from a tired horse, pale and dry under the August sun, and Clara Hale stood in the wavering heat with a carpetbag in one hand and her mother's shawl folded tight in the other. She was 28 and light-boned but strong from years of chores, from breaking colts that bucked like anger-made flesh, from holding herself steady when words in town struck harder than hooves ever could. Folks said she had a face made for quiet and eyes that kept their own counsel. They also said widow under their breath like a judgment. Today she would leave their stares and their talk. The stage stood at the hitching rail outside the Red Jack Saloon, wheels chalked with desert, mules stamping, the driver checking his brake with a curse and a spit. Clara had sold her last pair of silver earrings for the fair West and packed what little life she could carry: a hairbrush, 2 worn dresses, a Bible with her late husband's name written in a neat hand, and a small tin that held 3 carved buttons shaped like roses. She did not look back at the clapboard schoolhouse that never hired her, because hiring a woman meant trouble with fathers who liked to linger. She did not look at the store where Mrs. Grogan asked loud questions about who had come calling. She kept her eyes on the stage door and the far road as if both could open at once. She heard him before she saw him, the slow weight of a big man's step and the whisper of leather. Then his shadow fell over the toes of her boots. He was tall in a way that made doors seem small, broad in the shoulders under a faded canvas coat, hat brim low enough to cast his face in shade. He smelled faintly of pine pitch and horse. His hands were scarred across the knuckles and there was a stillness to him, like a windbreak in a winter field. He did not crowd her. He simply stood beside her as if he had a right to the piece of street where she waited. People watched, because people always watched, and the piano inside the saloon stumbled, missed a chord, then found itself again. He looked at the stage, then at her bag, then at her mouth like he was measuring the words she might say. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, a steady sound that made boasts and threats seem childish things. "I'll teach you to ride," he said, plain as a fence post, "and you'll teach me to love." The words landed in the dust between them and sat there, stubborn as a calf that won't budge. Clara felt the heat climb her neck, but not from shame, more from the sheer nerve of it. She kept her chin level. "Sir," she said, "I know how to ride." He tipped his head a fraction, as if he had expected as much. "Then you'll teach me the other." A small laugh, sharp and colourless, caught in her throat. A man had told her he loved her once. He'd died under a horse 2 springs later, and the town folded that loss into their stories about what happens when a woman's luck runs out. She studied the stranger's jaw, the way a small white scar nicked his upper lip, the way his thumbs hooked easy into his belt like he might be safer with his hands visible. "You're blocking the stage," she said, and he stepped back at once. The courtesy tugged something inside her she did not trust. "Name?" she asked, because men who spoke like that owed at least a name. He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "Cole Brannan," he answered. The way he said it told her he'd had other names once and did not use them anymore. He nodded toward the horizon, where the land rose and tumbled like a sleeping animal. "I run cattle north of here. Place needs 2 sets of hands. I'm offering a partnership, not charity." The word partnership made a ripple through the watching crowd, as if the air itself disapproved. Clara shifted her bag to the other hand. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said. "You ride straight. You look a man in the eyes and don't waste speech. You can keep books because you hold numbers in your fingers when you count change at Grogan's, and you don't scare." She did not ask how he'd seen her count or how he knew about fear. Men in small towns know everything and nothing at once. "It's a hard place," he added. "Winds cut in winter, creek runs dry some years. You'd have a room, your own key, a stake in the herd. We'd set rules now and keep them." It was not a marriage offer. It was a rope tossed from a riverbank, a practical thing with a knot she could grip. Behind him, near the trough, 2 men in long dusters stood like fence posts planted wrong, their hats too new, their eyes too interested in Cole's back. The taller one's gaze slid to Clara and then away, like he'd already counted her as a piece in a game. She told herself she had not seen the men. She told herself she would not take offers from shadows. The stage driver tossed a bag to the roof with a grunt. "Boarding in 5, he called. The voice shook the day awake. Cole did not repeat himself. He just reached into his coat and brought out something small. She thought at first it was a coin, but it was a sliver of wood, no bigger than a thumb joint, shaped like the head of a horse, the surface rubbed smooth. The eye was a tiny notch, and the mane was suggested by short, careful cuts. It was the kind of object a person makes with idle hands while waiting for the light to change in his life. He turned it in his fingers once, as if checking the lines, then set it gently on the railing of the stage step where her hand would pass. For luck, he said. It was not a charm she believed in, and yet it wasn't nothing. The wind came along Maine and tugged at her skirt hem, lifted grit that stung. A dog barked, then gave up and slept. Clara could feel the town leaning toward her choice, every mouth in every doorway ready to shape itself around a fresh story. She could climb into the stage and let the boards of the coach hold her and rattle her west until the land wore down the past. She could walk away with a stranger to land that needed hands more than it needed talk, and likely tie herself to big winters and the ache of work that never ends. Both paths asked a price, and neither promised rest. She looked again at the wooden horse head and thought of her husband's grave with its tilted marker that never seemed to stand straight against the wind. "Mr. Brannan," she said, and when she used the name he flinched just a breath, as if names were traps. "If I stayed, it would be for work and a clean roof and a fair share. It would not be for soft words." "I don't have soft words," he said. "I have fence wire and a winter store to lay in, and a creek bed that needs turning so it doesn't cut the north pasture. I have quiet." His mouth did something like a nearly smile then, quick and gone, and she saw he was younger than she'd first thought, and older too, where it counted. The driver slapped the brake lever. "Last call," he shouted. A few men shuffled. A woman dragged a child back from the wheel. Cole stepped aside again, turning a shoulder to shield her from the eyes on the boardwalk without making a show of it. It was a small movement, and it said a lot. He was built for standing between. Clara lifted her bag. The leather creaked, old and loyal. She took one step toward the stage door. The driver looked down at her from the box, squinting into the sun. "Name?" he asked. "Clara Hale," she said, and her voice didn't shake. He frowned, shuffled through a small ledger, ran a finger down a page. The street went a little quiet. "No," he said at last, voice flat as a closing ledger. "Tickets cancelled." The word cancelled felt like a slap that didn't sting until a second later. "By who?" she asked, but the driver had already turned the reins in his hands and clicked to the team. The two men in dusters shifted almost in unison, and the tall one smiled without teeth. Clara felt the ground move a fraction under her boots, as if a long train had just passed under the street where everyone could see it, only nobody could admit the tracks were there. She looked up at the driver again, but he kept his eyes on the road ahead, and when she turned, Cole was watching her with that steady, quiet attention that did not press. The wooden horsehead waited on the rail, catching a sliver of sun, and for the first time Clara understood how a small thing could weigh as much as a choice. The street emptied faster than Clara would have believed, though in Rattlespur people never passed up the chance to see trouble if they could manage it without being part of it. The stage rolled away in a slow cloud of dust, the sound of its wheels fading to a dull murmur. The two men in dusters didn't follow it. They stayed. One leaned his shoulder against the hitch rail as if he had all the time in the world. The other adjusted his hat brim so low she couldn't see his eyes. She felt them watching, not like men look at a woman, but like ranchers watch a gate swinging in the wind, measuring how fast something might get away and which way it would run. Cole's stance shifted almost too slightly to see, but it put him between her and them. Not like a performance, not squared off the way boys show their spoiling for a fight, just a quiet closing of the space. His height made the shadow fall over her again, and she realized the heat of the street had been soaking into her shoulders until now. "You know them?" she asked without looking at his face. He didn't answer right away. "Not their Sunday names," he said at last, and she heard the steel threaded through the calm. "But I've seen their kind ride behind worse men." "That's supposed to mean something to me?" she asked, fingers tightening on the handle of her carpet bag. "Only that you'd be smart not to let them ride behind you." There was something in his tone that told her he didn't expect her to trust him yet, and maybe didn't care if she did. He looked once over his shoulder toward the dusters, and they both smiled faintly like they'd been caught watching a game they were already winning. "You're stuck for the night," he said, turning his gaze back to her. "You can take a room over Mrs. Grogan's store, but she'll have your story sold before you set your bag down. or you can ride out with me now and avoid hearing what version of your life the town thinks is worth telling." Clara wanted to say she didn't care what Mrs. Grogan told people, but the truth was she'd been feeding herself that lie for years, and it had worn thin. She studied Cole's coat worn at the seams, stitched more than once by a hand that wasn't aiming for pretty, a man who fixed what he meant to keep. The two dusters started walking, slow and unhurried, in the direction of the livery stable. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. "What do they want with you?" she asked. He gave her that half-second pause again, as though deciding how much to put in the open. The same thing they want with anyone who's worth more dead than working. That sat in the space between them like a half-buried stone. She could leave it alone, step around it, or stub her toe and curse herself later. "You always speak in riddles?" she asked, but her voice had lost its bite. He shrugged. "Only when the plain truth costs more than I can pay in front of a crowd." Her grip eased on the carpet bag. She glanced at the wooden horse head still resting on the rail, then at the wide strip of sky above the rooftops where the stage had disappeared. "How far's your place?" she asked. "Half a day if we ride steady," he said. "Less if we cut through the break in the hills. But I'd not ride that way with those two watching." She looked toward the livery, empty now. The dusters had gone inside. Her mind was quick with images she didn't want herself in a livery stall with questions she wouldn't answer, or walking into Mrs. Grogan's parlour to find her own story, already in someone else's mouth. Cole bent to pick up the carved horse head, turned it once in his palm and tucked it into his coat. "Choice is yours," he said, "but decide before they do." She heard the truth in that. Some choices were made for you if you took too long. She gave the bag a small jerk upward to settle it against her side. "I'll ride as far as your gate," she said. "Then I'll see if I'm staying." His eyes, shadowed under the brim, didn't brighten exactly, but there was a shift there, a settling like a man hearing a gate close behind him against the wind. He led her toward the end of the street where a rangy bay gelding stood tied, coat the colour of coffee with dust stirred in. Beside him was a smaller dun mare, not pretty but with the wide chest of a good hill climber. "She's steady," he said, handing Clara the reins. "Not fast, not mean, knows the trail." Clara tested the mare's jaw with the reins, found it soft, then swung up in one smooth motion. If Cole noticed the easy way she settled into the saddle, he didn't say. They rode out past the last cluster of buildings, the sound of hooves muffled by hard-packed earth. The air smelled of sage and sun-warmed rock. Cole kept to her left, not crowding, but close enough that she felt the steady presence of him. Behind them, Rattlespur shrank until it was just a handful of shapes against the endless pale. For a mile or two, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that leaves room for listening, the creak of leather, the breath of horses, the low hiss of wind over grass that had seen too little rain. When the town was far enough behind, she asked, "That thing you said back there about me teaching you, did you mean it? Or was it just something to make me stop walking?" His head turned slightly, not all the way. "If I wanted you to stop walking, I could have just stood in the door. That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got right now," he said, and she had the feeling he was being as honest as he knew how. They passed a dry creek bed. The sand in its bottom rippled from the last hard rain months ago. Cole glanced back along the trail, then angled them into the shallow cut where the horses' hooves left no trace on the wind-carved sand. She didn't ask why. She already knew it was about not leaving a trail for the wrong eyes. The walls of the creek bed rose enough to cut the wind, and the shade cooled the air. In that quiet, his voice came low. "You'll hear things about me. Some true, some not. Best you decide for yourself which to keep." She considered that, the way he was giving her the work of judgment instead of trying to sell her a story. "And what if I decide you're not worth the trouble?" she asked. "Then you'll ride back to town and I'll still have to fix my fence." A ridge ahead marked where the creek bed ended, and beyond it the land opened into rolling pale grass that led toward a distant smudge of trees. Clara found her gaze drawn to it without thinking, like something in her bones remembered the pull of open country. She wondered if that was his trick to get a person to look ahead instead of back. The thought wasn't unpleasant, but she didn't let herself forget the way the dusters had looked at him, or the fact her ticket had been cancelled without her say. Somewhere above the ridge, a hawk wheeled once and vanished into the blue. Cole touched his hat brim toward it, like a man tipping to an old friend, and then the two of them rode on toward the far line of trees, the sun sliding behind them, the town gone. The land beyond the ridge rolled like a slow wave, lifting them higher until the sky seemed wider than it had any right to be. Grass, the pale colour of worn linen, bent under a faint wind that carried the smell of cedar. Here and there sagebrush broke the sameness, its silver green sharp against the earth. Clara's mare moved with an easy rhythm, ears flicking forward and back, listening to the land. Cole rode ahead now, guiding them toward a narrow trail that threaded between low hills like a seam. She noticed how he sat the saddle loose but alert, as if ready to turn or stop without thought. Even his horse seemed to move quieter than it should, hooves finding the softer ground, avoiding loose rock. They didn't speak for a while. Clara didn't mind. It gave her room to think. Her ticket west was gone, stolen from under her nose. 2 men in dusters had watched her like she was already marked, and now she was riding beside a stranger with a voice like a low fire and a face half hidden under his hat brim. She told herself she would get to his gate, as she'd said, then make her choice. But the trail wound on, and part of her knew that once she saw the place, it would be harder to walk away. By mid-afternoon, the hills closed in, and the trail narrowed to little more than a ribbon of dirt between slopes dotted with pinon pine. Shadows lay cool here, and the air smelled faintly of resin. Cole slowed his gelding, letting her mare draw up alongside. He nodded toward a break in the trees to the left. "There's a spring in there," he said. "Good water, we'll let them drink." Clara followed him off the trail, ducking her head under low branches until they came to a small clearing, where water bubbled from under a flat rock into a shallow pool. The horses drank greedily. Clara dismounted, letting the mare's reins hang loose so she could step into the water if she liked. She knelt and cupped her hands, tasting the spring cool and sweet, with a hint of stone. "You know this land well," she said, watching him check his horse's hooves for small stones. He glanced up. "You have to. It won't forgive you for not paying attention." The way he said it made her think he wasn't just talking about the land. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Cole saw it too. His head turned sharply toward the trees, though his hand didn't go to his gun. Instead, he straightened slowly, his gaze fixed on the brush beyond, the clearing. "Deer," he said after a moment, though his voice was tight. Clara strained to see, but whatever had moved was gone. They watered the horses, remounted and rode on. The hills fell away after another mile, revealing a wide valley scattered with cottonwoods. A creek cut through its centre, the water catching the late light like a strip of glass. Fences ran here and there, some upright, others sagging, as if they'd been standing too many seasons without mending. Beyond them, tucked against a low rise, stood a house long and low, built from rough-cut logs gone grey with weather. A small barn leaned a little to one side, its roof patched with mismatched shingles. The place looked tired but alive, like an old workhorse still pulling its load. "That's it," Cole said. Clara studied the house as they rode closer. Smoke rose from a stovepipe, faint but steady, and she wondered who had tended that fire. "You live alone?" she asked. "I do now." It was an answer that didn't invite questions, but she felt one pushing anyway. She let it go. At the barn, Cole swung down and led his gelding inside. Clara followed, the smell of hay and animals warming the cool shadows. The barn was neat. Tools hung in their places, but the empty stalls told her he kept no more than the 2 horses they'd ridden in on. He uncinched his saddle, moving with the same quiet care he'd shown all day. "You can stable her here," he said, nodding toward a stall bedded with fresh straw. Clara unsaddled the mare herself, hanging the tack on a wooden peg. The work felt good, grounding her after the long ride. Inside the house, the air was cooler, the log walls holding back the heat. The single main room held a broad stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tin plates and a few books. Everything was plain but clean. A braided rug lay near the hearth, worn in the centre from boot heels. Cole set a kettle on the stove. "Coffee?" she nodded. While he worked, she wandered the room, noting the small details. A row of horseshoes over the door, polished smooth at the edges from handling. A set of spurs hanging on the wall, the leather straps cracked but oiled. Her eyes caught on a wooden figure on the mantel, a horse, carved in the same careful style as the head he'd shown her in town. This one was whole, head bowed slightly, legs poised mid-step. She reached toward it without thinking. That one's been with me a long time, he said, his voice quiet but close behind her. She set it back gently. You carve? When there's time. The coffee boiled, filling the room with its bitter scent. They drank at the table, the mugs warm in their hands. The silence between them was different now, heavier but not unfriendly. Clara felt the weight of the day settling into her bones. I'll take the spare room tonight, she said, setting her mug down. In the morning? We'll see. Cole nodded. That's fair. They didn't speak of the dusters, or the cancelled ticket, or why she'd agreed to ride out here at all. But as she rose to take her things to the small room at the back of the house, she glanced through the window toward the barn. A shadow moved there too quick, too deliberate to be the horses. She froze, listening. The sound came faint but sharp, the creak of a hinge, the soft scrape of wood. Cole was already moving, his chair pushed back without a sound, his hand near the revolver at his hip. They reached the door together, stepping out into the fading light. The barn stood quiet now, the smell of hay drifting on the evening air. But the stall door she'd latched behind the mare hung open, swinging gently. Cole's eyes scanned the yard, the line of trees beyond. His voice, when it came, was so low she almost didn't catch it. We weren't followed by accident. A long breath slipped from her chest, and the night around them felt suddenly larger, the shadows deeper. Somewhere beyond the trees something moved, a faint rustle, like a boot in dry grass. And then the sound was gone. The last of the daylight bled out behind the hills, leaving the yard in a blue shadow that made every tree and fence post look like it might be someone waiting. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her fingers curled tight around the frame. Cole hadn't moved from where he stood, boots planted in the dirt, his head turned toward the tree line. The stillness in him was different now, not the quiet, patient kind she'd noticed in town, but the coiled, listening stillness of a man waiting for something he'd already decided was coming. Could be a coyote, she said, though her voice didn't even convince herself. He shook his head slowly. Coyotes don't open stall doors. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest smell of smoke, not from the stove inside, but the acrid tang of a campfire gone cold. Whoever had been near wasn't far enough yet for the scent to fade. Cole stepped down from the porch, his eyes on the ground like he was reading it. Clara followed, every crunch of her boots on the hard earth sounding far too loud. They went to the barn first. The mare stood in her stall, ears pricked, the whites of her eyes showing faintly in the gloom. She wasn't panicked, but she was watching the open door as if she expected something to come back through it. Cole closed the door gently, looping the latch twice. Then he crossed to the far wall and slid something from behind a stack of hay bales, a Winchester rifle, its metal oiled and dull, the stock worn smooth. Clara watched the way his hands knew it, the way the barrel rested against his palm like it belonged there. You keep that in the barn? She asked. Closer to the animals than to me, he said, checking the chamber before snapping it shut. They give warning before I ever hear trouble. It was a strange kind of answer, but it made sense in its own way. Outside again, the moon had started to lift over the eastern ridge, pale and thin, laying silver over the tops of the cottonwoods. Cole scanned, the shadows one more time, then nodded toward the house. We'll eat inside, lights low. Clara didn't argue. She followed him back in, and he slid the bolt on the door with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet. He set the rifle within reach by the table and ladled stew from a pot she hadn't noticed earlier. It was thick with potatoes and beans, the smell comforting enough to make her realize she hadn't eaten since morning. They ate without much talk, the clink of spoons in tin bowls the only sound. Halfway through her meal, she caught him looking toward the window again. You think they followed us from town? She asked. I think they've been following me longer than that. His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something in the set of his jaw that made her believe he'd been carrying that fact for a while. What do they want? His spoon stilled. For a moment she thought he might ignore the question. Then he said, Some folks keep grudges like other folks keep gold locked away, waiting for the right day to spend it. He didn't look at her when he said it, and she decided not to push further. After they cleaned the bowls, he doused the lamp until only a thin wick of light showed. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners, softening the rough edges of the room. Spare rooms at the back, he told her. Bolt it from the inside. She carried her bag down the short hall, the boards creaking under her steps. The room was small, just a narrow bed, a chest at the foot, and a single window that looked toward the barn. The moonlight spilled across the quilt, patching it in silver and blue. She set her bag on the chest and checked the window latch. Then she stood there a moment longer, listening. The night outside was quiet, but not empty. She could hear the faint rush of the creek, a distant nighthawk calling, and once the low thud of a hoof shifting in the barn. She was sitting on the bed, unlacing her boots, when a sound cut through soft, deliberate, from somewhere outside the window. Not close, but near enough to make her breath catch. It came again, a faint rustle in the grass followed by silence. She crossed to the window and eased the curtain aside. The yard lay still, the barn a dark shape against the paler ground. Then she saw it, a figure just at the edge of the trees, half in shadow. She couldn't make out the face, only the shape of a hat brim and the suggestion of a long coat. The figure didn't move toward the house, just stood there, watching. Her stomach turned cold. She let the curtain fall and stepped back, her pulse thudding in her ears. She thought of going to Cole, but before she could decide, she heard the creak of a board in the main room, followed by his voice, low and steady. "You saw him?" She stepped into the hall. He was already there, the rifle in his hands, his eyes darker than she'd seen them yet. She nodded. "Edge of the trees." "They'll test the fences before they come through," he said quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. "See what holds." He moved past her to the front door, opening it just enough to look out. The night air spilled in, cool and sharp with pine. He stood there a long moment, then closed the door and slid the bolt again. "Best get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll see what they're after." It wasn't much comfort, but she went back to the small room and sat on the bed again, leaving her boots where she could reach them. She lay back, the quilt light over her legs, and stared at the ceiling where the moonlight made faint patterns through the window. She listened for every sound, the groan of the rafters in the cooling night, the occasional shift of the horses, the soft murmur of the creek. Sometime in the dark hours, a knock-knock on her door, but on the house itself, pulled her upright. 3 slow raps, spaced like whoever stood there had all the time in the world. She held her breath. In the main room, a chair scraped softly, and then the unmistakable click of a rifle being lifted. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't at the front. It was at the back of the house. The sound of that second knock seemed to stretch the night wider, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Clara sat rigid on the edge of the bed, bare feet pressed to the quilt, waiting for something, another knock, the scrape of boots, anything. But the quiet closed in again, thick and watchful. She slid her feet into her boots without tying them and eased her door open. The hall smelled faintly of the banked stove fire, that low warmth mixed with the sharper tang of oil from Cole's rifle. He was a shadow by the back door, one hand on the latch, the other holding the rifle loose but ready. Moonlight through the window above the sink silvered his hat brim and the set of his jaw. He didn't look at her when he spoke, his voice barely more than breath. "Stay behind me." She did, though her legs prickled with the urge to run back to the small room and bolt the door. He lifted the latch slow, then cracked the door just wide enough to see out. The yard was still. The barn crouched in its place, the cottonwoods whispering in a breeze she couldn't feel from inside. But she knew he'd seen something by the way his shoulders went still. He shut the door without sound and turned toward her. One of them, maybe both. "Here?" she asked. "Testing the dark," he said, "seeing how long it takes me to answer." It was an unsettling thought that the knock wasn't a demand, but a measure. She followed him to the front of the house, where he took a lamp from the shelf but didn't light it. Instead, he went to the window, keeping low, and looked out toward the open stretch of pasture that sloped down to the creek. Clara edged closer, careful not to cross in front of the glass. There was nothing, just grass silver in the moonlight, the black ribbon of the creek, the far shadow of trees. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw a darker smudge move along the fence line. A man, bent, slightly, walking slow. Not toward the house, not toward the barn, just along the fence, dragging a stick or something against the posts. The sound was faint but steady. Tap, tap, tap. "What's he doing?" she whispered. Cole's jaw tightened. "Counting." She waited for him to explain, but he didn't. Instead, he stood and moved back into the deeper shadow of the room. "They're telling me they can get close whenever they want," he said finally. "Tomorrow they might decide to come in." The thought of it, men like those dusters stepping through this quiet, plain room, made her chest feel tight. "Why wait?" she asked. Not sure she wanted the answer. Some men like the hunt more than the kill. There was nothing to do but wait out the night. Cole kept the rifle close, moving between the windows, the back door, and the front. Clara sat at the table, listening to the sounds outside shift with the hours, the soft rush of the creek, the wind turning in the cottonwoods, the occasional distant call of a night bird. Once she thought she heard a low whistle, but it faded so quickly she might have imagined it. It was near dawn when the stillness broke. A sharp crack, a fence post splitting, came from the far side of the barn. Cole was already at the door, boots silent on the worn boards. He stepped out without looking back. An instinct, or maybe stubbornness, sent Clara after him. The early light was cold and grey, the kind that made the world look like it hadn't decided yet whether it would be kind that day. Around the barn, the smell of trampled grass was fresh. The mare shifted restlessly in her stall, nostrils flaring. Clara saw the damage before Cole spoke. One of the corner posts on the south fence had been split near its base, the wood splintered and wet. The wire sagged, not quite down but close. "Wasn't like that yesterday," she said. He crouched, running his fingers over the fresh break. "They're showing me what they can do when I'm awake," he said, standing again, "so I can think about what they'll do when I'm not." A faint trail of boot prints led away from the fence toward the creek. Cole followed it a short way, then stopped. "They crossed the water," he said, pointing to where the grass bent on the far bank. "We won't see them now until they want us to." Back at the barn, he latched the door tight and checked each stall. Clara noticed the way his eyes kept sweeping the edges of the yard, not in panic, but in the steady way a man checks for changes in weather. Inside, the kettle was still warm from the banked fire. He poured 2 mugs and set one in front of her. "You still thinking about heading back to town?" he asked. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "And walk into Mrs. Grogan's mouth? Or those 2 dusters' arms? Not today." A slow nod, almost approval. "Then we'll set to mending that fence after breakfast." The day came up pale and clear, but it didn't wash away the unease left by the night. Clara helped with the mending, holding the wire, while Cole replaced the post, the smell of fresh-cut wood mixing with the damp scent of the creek. The work was steadying hammer blows, the twist of wire, the rhythm of tasks that could be finished. But every now and then she'd glance toward the trees and feel the prickle between her shoulders, certain someone could be there, just far enough to vanish when she looked too hard. By mid-morning, the fence stood straight again, the wire tight. Cole leaned on the post driver, scanning the horizon. "They'll see this," he said. "They'll know I'm not letting it go." "And then?" she asked. "And then we see if they mean to push, or just circle." It wasn't much of a plan, but she understood it was the only one a man in his position could make. The rest of the day passed without a sign, no movement in the trees, no strange sounds. But the quiet felt like a held breath, and by the time the sun dipped low again, Clara found herself glancing toward the barn, the windows, the dark line of the creek. When night fell, Cole set the lamp low again, the rifle leaning where his hand could find it. They ate bread and beans, the sound of their forks small in the hush. She didn't ask if he thought the men would come again. She could see in his eyes he was already listening for them, and just when the dark felt too deep, too still, the whistle came again, low, curling, from somewhere near the barn. The whistle slid through the night like something that didn't belong to the air, curling low and slow before tapering into silence. Clara froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Cole didn't move at first, just set his fork down quiet as a man putting away a thought. His head tilted, listening, eyes fixed on nothing. When the whistle came again, it was closer, drifting from the shadows beyond the barn. Not a tune, not a call to a horse, just a simple rise and fall, like a man reminding you he was out there. Cole stood, reached for the rifle by the wall, and checked the chamber without looking at it. "Stay inside," he said, voice low. "I've done enough staying inside," Clara answered, before she could stop herself. His eyes cut to hers, not angry, but measuring. "You stay where I can put you behind a wall if I need to," he said, and it wasn't a request. She didn't argue, but she followed him to the front door, keeping in the shadow of the room. The night outside was sharp with cold, the kind that slid through seams in your clothes and stayed there. The moon hung low over the ridge, pale and watchful. Cole stepped onto the porch, boots soundless on the worn planks, and scanned the yard. Nothing moved but the wind in the cottonwoods. Then, from somewhere just past the barn, came the soft scuff of a boot in dirt. "Show yourself," Cole called, not loud, but with the weight of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. A figure stepped into the strip of moonlight between barn and tree line. It was the taller of the two dusters from town, hat brim low, hands empty. He didn't come forward, just stood where he was, rocking slightly on his heels. "Evening, Brannon," the man said, his voice oily smooth. "Heard you'd taken in some company." Cole didn't answer. "She rides well," the man went on, and Clara felt her skin crawl. "Figure she might like a finer place than this old spread." "That why you've been skulking in the dark? To offer her lodging?" Cole asked, calm as still water. The man's smile flickered. "We came for you, Brannon. She's just a reminder the world don't forget what it's owed." "I don't owe you a thing," Cole said. "Oh, you owe," the man answered, stepping forward a pace. "You and me got old business. Man you left bleeding in Deadwood still had friends. Friends who remember. Friends who don't like debts hanging too long." Clara's eyes darted to Cole. He didn't look away from the man, but she caught the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw. "You done talking?" Cole asked. The man shrugged. "For now, but fences break, doors open. You can't watch her and the herd both." Then he stepped back into the shadows, and in the space of 3 heartbeats, the night swallowed him whole. No crunch of boots, no rustle of leaves, just gone. Cole stayed on the porch a long moment after, rifle still in his hands, his eyes on the barn. Clara could feel the air in her chest hitch, the slow thud of her own pulse. Finally he turned, stepping back inside and bolting the door. "We start moving the herd to the north pasture tomorrow," he said, "close to the house, less room for them to hide." "You're expecting them back," she said. "I'd be a fool not to." The rest of the night passed without another sound, but sleep didn't come easy. Clara lay in the small room, staring at the faint square of moonlight on the quilt, listening to the house breathe and shift. Every creak felt like a footstep. Every brush of wind against the wall felt like a hand. At first light, Cole had the coffee on, and was already pulling on his coat. They saddled the horses in a quiet that was more about focus than fear. The herd was small, 20 heads scattered across the southern end of the property, grazing near the creek. Moving them wasn't hard work, but it took steady riding to keep them bunched and moving toward the north pasture. Clara worked the flank while Cole led at the front, the two of them calling to the cattle when they slowed. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth where the creek cut through. For a while the work dulled the memory of the night, the low calls to the herd, the creak of saddle leather, the steady clop of hooves. When they reached the north pasture, Cole opened the gate and waved them through. The grass here was thicker, the ground higher and drier. It was a better spot, but Clara could see what he meant. It was also closer to the house, where a man could keep an eye on things from the porch. They checked the fencing, tightening wire where it sagged, setting a new brace post where one had rotted at the base. Cole worked with quiet efficiency, his big hands steady on the tools. As they were finishing, Clara's gaze drifted toward the far fence line. Beyond it, maybe 50 yards away, a shape moved in the grass, slow, deliberate. She narrowed her eyes, but before she could speak, Cole straightened and followed her line of sight. The shape stilled. Then it rose just enough to catch the lighter man's head and shoulders, hat brim dark against the sky. He didn't move closer, didn't run, just stood there. Watching. Cole laid down the tool in his hand. "Get the gate," he said quietly. By the time they crossed the pasture, the man was gone. No sign in the grass, no sound in the air. Just the open land stretching away to the hills. That evening they ate in the same quiet as before. But Clara noticed Cole kept the rifle closer now, leaning against the wall beside his chair. When darkness came, he lit no lamp at all, and the two of them sat in the dim glow from the stove listening. For a while there was only the usual night chorus, the creak, the wind, the far-off bark of a coyote. Then, faint but clear, came the whistle again. This time it wasn't near the barn, it was closer, much closer, and it was answered by another, from the opposite side of the house. The two whistles braided together in the dark, one low and drawn out, the other sharp and mocking. Clara's spine stiffened, every nerve in her skin tuned to the sound. Cole was already on his feet, rifle in hand, moving with that same contained energy she'd seen when the fence post split. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. 2 sides, he said, eyes on the front window. They're testing how fast I can choose. Clara moved to the wall beside the table, heart pounding. You think they'll try the doors? They'll try the dark first, he said. Doors come after. The second whistle came again, closer, almost under the windowsill. Then silence, thick, deliberate. Cole motioned her toward the hallway. Stay where you can see the back, but don't show yourself. She slipped into the narrow hall, the boards cool under her feet. From the small room, she peered through the gap in the curtain. Moonlight spilled silver over the yard, picking out the shapes of the barn and the cottonwoods. At first, nothing moved. Then, from the far side of the barn, a shadow detached itself and began to drift along the fence line, slow, measured, like a man walking in no hurry at all. At the same moment, the front porch boards creaked. Once. Twice. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't look away from the window. The figure in the yard had stopped. Whoever it was stood still, head tilted, as if listening to the steps on the porch too. A soft knock came at the front door. Not like the slow raps of the night before, this was quicker, almost polite. Cole didn't answer it. Instead, the scrape of a chair told her he'd moved toward the sound. She heard the low click of the rifle's hammer easing back. Brannon, a voice called through the wood, not the tall man. From before, this one was rougher, with a sandpaper edge. We're not here to ruin your pretty place, we just want to talk. You've been talking all night, Cole said. Say your piece and get off my land. Not out here, the voice replied. Face to face, man to man. No, Cole said flatly. The man laughed, the sound sharp in the cold air. You afraid I'll see what's behind you? Or who? From her window, Clara saw the shadow by the fence move again, slipping toward the barn. The mare must have caught the scent because a sharp, anxious snort cut through the night. The figure stilled, then turned its head toward her window. For a moment, even in the dim light, she felt the weight of eyes finding her. Her throat went dry. Cole, she called softly. The porch boards creaked again, the sound of boots retreating. The knock didn't come back. Instead, there was the faint crunch of steps moving away from the front and around the side of the house. Cole appeared in the hall, his shadow long against the wall. They're trying to pull me between, he said, one at the front, one at the barn. See who I choose to chase. He crossed to her window and looked out. The shadow by the fence was gone. In its place, the cottonwoods swayed faintly, their branches whispering in the breeze. Come on, he said, heading toward the kitchen. If they want me to split, I'll do the opposite. She followed him to the back door. Instead of stepping outside, he barred it and dragged a heavy crate across the floor, wedging it against the frame. Then he crossed to the front and did the same. They can't get in without noise, he said. That's enough for tonight. The rest of the dark hours stretched long. They sat at the table with the rifle between them, the stove's low glow painting their faces in amber and shadow. Neither spoke much. The whistles didn't come again, but the silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like a pause in a game they hadn't agreed to play. When dawn finally spilled pale light over the ridge, Cole stood and stretched, the movement slow from sitting so long. They'll pull back for now, he said, but they'll leave a mark before they go. He was right. Outside, the frost-wet grass glittered under the sun, and across the front porch someone had scratched a crude shape into the wood, a long slash intersected by a shorter one almost like a cattle brand. That yours? Clara asked. No, he said, studying it. But I've seen it before. Deadwood. He nodded once. Man who carried it never let go of a grudge. Guess his friends don't either. The mark wasn't deep, but it was deliberate, cut clean into the grain. Cole didn't sand it out. He didn't even touch it. Just turned and walked toward the barn. Clara followed, her breath making small clouds in the morning air. Inside, the mare shifted nervously, eyes rolling at the shadows near the far stall. It took Clara a moment to see why. On the wall, where a coil of rope had hung the day before, something dangled 3. Carved wooden horse heads strung on twine, swaying slightly in the draft. Each was rougher than Cole's work, the cuts jagged, the eyes gouged deep. Cole took them down, his face unreadable. He didn't break them, didn't throw them, just dropped them into a feed sack and tied it shut. They want me rattled, he said. They don't know me well enough. but Clara could see in the way his jaw set that this was no longer just about him. By midday, they'd patrolled the fence lines again. No fresh breaks, no tracks they could follow. The land felt empty, but Clara knew better now. Emptiness could be a kind of cover. Late in the afternoon, they sat on the porch steps, drinking coffee gone lukewarm. The sun dipped lower, setting the grass in the pasture to gold. For a brief moment it looked like peace. Then, far down the slope by the creek, a thin line of smoke began to rise. The smoke lifted in a narrow thread, twisting against the pale sky. Clara set her cup down on the step without looking away. Cole had already risen, his eyes narrowing as he gauged the distance. "That's no campfire," he said. "Too close, too straight." She stood, shading her eyes. From here the creek glittered like broken glass in the late light, and on the far bank she could just make out movement, two figures bent over something near the water. One straightened, tossing an armful of brush onto the growing flames. "They're not hiding anymore," she said. "No," Cole agreed, voice low. "They're telling us it's time." They saddled the horses in silence. The mare's ears flicked nervously as if she sensed the tension humming in the air. Cole checked the rifle, then the revolver on his hip. "We ride down slow, let them see us coming." The trail to the creek dipped between low ridges, the grass thick enough to hush the hoofbeats. As they drew closer, the smell of smoke sharpened, bitter with green wood. The two men stood on the far bank now, both in dusters, both watching. One was the tall, smooth-talking one from town, the other had the rough voice from the night before. Between them, on the ground, lay a rope looped and knotted in a way that made Clara's stomach twist. Cole reined in a dozen yards from the water. "You've been making a lot of noise for men who claim they just want to talk," he called. The tall one smiled, slow and lazy. "Talking's over, Brannon. You can come across or we can come get you." "Why now?" Cole asked. The rougher one laughed, jerking his chin toward Clara. "Because we finally know what'll bring you to us." Cole's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You lay a hand on her and you won't have another day to regret it." "That's the idea," the man said, grinning. The flames snapped, throwing sparks into the air. Clara felt the heat on her face even across the water. She didn't wait for Cole's signal. Her hand was already on the mare's neck, steadying her as she nudged forward. The mare splashed into the creek, cold water soaking Clara's boots. The dusters stepped back, surprised, and that was all the opening Cole needed. He spurred his gelding forward, the rifle lifting to his shoulder in one smooth motion. He didn't fire, just held steady, the barrel tracking their every step. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "You want to settle Deadwood, you settle it with me." The tall one hesitated. The other spat into the dirt. "Fine, you walk into the hills with us. She stays here. We don't come back." Cole's eyes flicked to Clara for the briefest moment, and she knew he wouldn't agree to their terms. She swung down from the mare, landing in the wet grass, and stepped toward the rope on the ground. The tall man moved as if to block her, but she was faster, kicking the coil into the fire. Flames caught the dry hemp instantly, snapping it into blackened curls. The rough one cursed and lunged, and that was when Cole fired. The shot cracked like a whip, the bullet kicking dirt a breath from the man's boots. "Next one won't miss," Cole warned. Silence fell, thick and sudden. Smoke drifted between them, stinging Clara's eyes. She kept her gaze steady on the two men, refusing to step back. Finally, the tall one raised his hand slightly. "Not worth dying over today," he said, "but this ain't done, Brannon." "Then you'd best start running," Cole said. They backed away, slipping into the trees, their shapes swallowed by the shadows. The fire hissed as Cole kicked dirt over it, stamping out the last of the smoke. When it was gone, the air smelled of wet ash and something else, an ending, though not a clean one. Clara looked at Cole. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but she could see the set of his shoulders easing. "They'll be back," she said. "Probably," he admitted, "but so will we." They rode home slow, the sun bleeding into the horizon, turning the land copper and gold. By the time they reached the porch, the sky was deepening into night. Cole leaned the rifle against the rail, glancing toward the far hills where the dusters had vanished. "You could still go," he said quietly. "West. Start over somewhere without my trouble." Clara met his gaze steady. "I'm not looking for somewhere without trouble. I'm looking for somewhere I can stand." His eyes softened in that way they sometimes did, like the hard lines of him could bend without breaking. "Then I'll teach you to ride the range my way," he said, "and maybe you'll teach me whatever it is keeps you here." The wind carried the faint scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere out in the dark, coyotes called, their voices weaving over the hills. Clara took a breath, tasting the air, and felt the ground under her boots as something she could claim. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the dusters would come back, or if peace might last long enough to mend another fence. But for tonight, the house stood warm behind them, the pasture lay quiet, and the man beside her was still here. And that, she decided, was enough to start with. If you enjoyed this tale of grit, danger, and slow-burning frontier love, imagine how the story could deepen when the past rides back into town, carrying secrets even Cole hasn't told. Keep reading the next chapter of their fight for a place in each other, in a land that takes as much as it gives.